People think the worst part is waiting. That is what they say to women when there is a war. Be brave. Be patient. Wait for him. Pray. Keep the house standing. Keep the letters. Keep the hope. Keep a little part of life clean and ordinary so he has somewhere human to return to. And while he is gone, everyone around you behaves as though waiting is the great test. The waiting wife. The lamp in the window. The folded letter. The brave smile at the station. The hand raised in goodbye, still believing goodbye is a bridge and not a blade. I used to think so too. I thought waiting would be the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was after. After the trains. After the telegrams that did not come. After the street had already decided which houses would be pitted and which congratulated. After the door opened. After the boots crossed the threshold. After the war gave me my husband back in body and let me discover, slowly and without the courtesy of one clean wound, that some part of him had stayed behind where I could not go. People know how to comfort widows. They have language for that. Clumsy language, often foolish language, but language all the same. Loss, sacrifice, grief, gone. They do not know what to say to a woman whose husband comes home alive and yet begins vanishing in front of her over the next 20 years in ways no doctor can point to on an X-ray. They do not know what to say when a man eats at your table, sleeps in your bed, kisses your forehead some mornings, fixes the broken latch, carries your child to bed, and still feels, in the deepest room of your understanding, as though he belongs partly to another world that has kept legal claim over him. There is no ceremony for that. No black dress. No casserole line. No public shape people recognize as mourning. And yet it is mourning, or part of mourning, or some stranger cousin to it, because I did not lose my husband all at once. I lost him in pieces, in silences, in flinches, in the way he stopped sitting with his back to open doorways, in the way loud celebrations made him disappear inward, in the way he would sometimes wake already frightened before his eyes were fully open, as if sleep itself had become enemy territory. That is why I am speaking now, because I am old enough to stop protecting people from the truth by sanding it down into civility, because I was told for years, by decent women and indecent ones, by neighbors and church ladies and relatives who meant well, and some who only liked the sound of their own advice, that I should be grateful. And I was grateful. That is what makes this difficult. I was grateful he came home. Grateful he was alive. Grateful the war had not put his name on a telegram and pinned my whole future under one sentence: I would never escape. But gratitude is not the same as relief. And relief is not the same as peace. And peace, real peace, not the kind men declare in newspapers, never truly entered our house the way people assume it does once the shooting stops. Because the war came home in him. Not loudly at first. Not dramatically. Not in ways anyone else would have noticed over one polite Sunday visit. It came home in weather changes of the soul. And I was the one who lived with the climate. So let me begin before the marriage learned fear. Before the night terrors. Before the silence after loud noises. Before the child asking me in a whisper why Daddy looked angry when he wasn't angry at all. Before I learned that loving a survivor means making room at your table for things that will never introduce themselves properly. Let me begin when I was still only a girl waiting to be chosen by life. I was not born for tragedy. That sounds vain, perhaps. But what I mean is simpler. I was born for ordinary expectations. A house, a husband, children, if God allowed them, work enough to fill the day, laundry that smelled like sunlight when weather was kind, neighbors near enough to help and far enough not to know too much. The long, respectable shape of a life most women in my town imagined without even calling it imagination, because it was simply what life did if it behaved. I did not dream of war, because no sensible girl does. I dreamed of rooms. Not in the shallow way people later mock, as if domestic dreams are smaller than other dreams. Rooms are not small to women who understand what it means to build a life inside them. A kitchen with curtains I had chosen. A bed shared with affection and ordinary fatigue. A table where somebody came home hungry because home existed, and hunger there was a simple thing. A hallway with children's shoes left where they ought not to be. A garden perhaps, or just a yard with enough sunlight to claim a few hopeful flowers. I wanted, very simply, a life one could set down carefully and then keep. That was the dream. And in those years, before history developed its appetite, it did not feel unreasonable. I met Thomas at a church picnic, which sounds too clean to be true, and is therefore precisely true. He was not the loudest man there, not the handsomest either, if we are speaking in the strict market language women pretend not to understand when they are young. What he had was steadiness, not dullness. Steadiness. The kind of presence that makes a woman feel the ground under a conversation. He listened as if your answer mattered before he even knew whether it would entertain him. He laughed with his whole face, but not too often. He had a way of folding his hands when thinking that made him seem both practical and kind. He asked me questions that were not ornamental. What books I liked. Whether I preferred autumn because of the weather or because it gave everyone an excuse to become sentimental. Whether I thought a person could live honestly in a small town all his life without going half mad. I told him that depended on the town. He said, "Good. You're not foolish. That is one way love begins. Not with thunder, with relief." He worked hard, came from a good family, was not afraid of tools, children, silence, or women who answered directly. All of these, to me, looked like forms of wealth. We courted in the old way. Walks, porch conversations, church, social evenings where everyone pretended not to see what was plainly happening because communities like the pleasant theater of respectability. He was not grand with words. Thank God. Men too fluent in romance often prove unfit for the long labor of marriage. Thomas did not promise the moon. He promised work, a house, honesty, the kind of life where if trouble came, we would stand on the same side of it. At 20 or 21, that sounded to me like the most beautiful offer in the world. And perhaps it was. War did not make him false. That matters. It only made fulfillment more complicated than either of us had imagined. We married young enough still to believe time would be generous if we met it properly. The first year was poor in money and rich in everything else. A rented place, thin walls, a kitchen that turned mean in summer heat and drafty in winter, a bed that creaked under every innocent movement so loudly that we learned to laugh before we learned to resent it. I loved that life, not because it was easy, because it was ours. There is a holiness to shared effort when the future still feels cooperative. Soup stretched one meal farther than expected. A chair repaired instead of replaced. Thomas bringing home something small from town because he had seen it and thought it would make me smile. My hands in flour, his hands in grease. Evening light through cheap curtains making everything look richer than it was. Those are the things war steals too, though no one hangs medals for them. We had not yet had children when the war widened enough to begin reaching for the men around us. At first it was distant. Maps, names on the radio, speeches, editorial certainty from people whose sons still slept safely upstairs. Then it came closer. Not to our street exactly, not at first. To the atmosphere. Men talking differently after supper. Women calculating differently in church. Mothers looking at their sons, as if some invisible clerk had begun sorting futures already. Thomas did not speak dramatically about duty. That was another thing I loved in him. He was not made of slogans. But when the time came, he was not the kind of man who could remain seated while the room around him stood. I knew that before he did. Or perhaps he knew and hoped I might say the sentence that would permit him to hate himself less for staying. I did not say it. I could not. There are wives who urge. Wives who plead. Wives who say do your part. Wives who say stay here. I did neither. I stood in the terrible middle where love and decency begin pulling at one another until both bleed. When he enlisted, I remember the exact absurd thing I noticed. His collar was crooked in the photograph. Even then, part of me was still domestic enough to think, if I had been standing there, I would have fixed that. That is what women carry into war. Not strategy, not speeches, collars, buttons, thermoses, the condition of socks. Whether a man who may soon be shot at has remembered to take the scarf, because the weather will turn by evening. We marry bodies before history makes claims on them. That day at the station, I smiled more than truth deserved. So did he. That is another social crime war forces upon the decent. Performance for the sake of the other person's courage. I said I would wait. He said he would come back. Neither of us had authority over either promise. Then the train moved, and waiting began. Everyone tells women waiting is passive. It is not. Waiting in wartime is work. You wake to it, sleep badly under it, carry it in your arms while sweeping, shopping, writing letters, mending clothes, smiling at neighbors, pretending not to count weeks too hard, pretending not to hate the women whose husbands have not gone and the women whose husbands have returned with limbs intact and eyes still belonging fully to the room. You live two lives. The visible one, the one on Main Street, at church, at the grocer's, where you are expected to hold yourself in reasonable shape and not become a burden on everyone else's hope. And the invisible one, the life of calculations. How long since the last letter? How delayed is the mail? What did that phrase in his last note mean? When did they say his unit had moved? If he says he is fine, does that mean fine, or only alive enough to write the word? I wrote faithfully. So did he, when he could. Letters are a poor substitute for a body, but a magnificent substitute for nothing. And in war most wives learn gratitude for magnificently insufficient things. His letters changed over time. At first they were still him as I knew him. Observant, dry in humor, specific. Mentions of weather, bad coffee, mud, the absurdity of military food. The small facts that keep a letter human and keep a wife from turning the man into pure danger in her imagination. Later they shortened, not coldly, carefully. He stopped describing too much. That frightened me more than any description would have. Silence is often where war first appears in a man's writing, not in what he says, in what he begins protecting you from. There were women who read between every line until they drove themselves half mad. There were women who refused to read between the lines at all because madness seemed the less respectable option. I did both, depending on the day. Sometimes I slept with a letter under my pillow like a child with a talisman. Sometimes I resented paper with an anger so sharp it embarrassed me. What is a letter compared to a hand? Compared to weight beside you in bed? Compared to hearing a man clear his throat in the next room and knowing, without looking, precisely who remains yours in the world? Waiting made me older before my time and younger in some humiliating ways. I prayed like a child, bargained like one. If you bring him back, I will never complain again. If you bring him back, I will be kinder. If you bring him back, I will bear anything. Women say such things into dark rooms because war reduces theology to barter if left unattended long enough. Some wives became grim, others brighter than usual, as if cheerfulness itself were part of the war effort. I became efficient. That was my method. I kept things in order, paid bills, answered letters, helped neighbors where I could, maintained a life sturdy enough that if he returned, there would still be recognizable walls waiting to receive him. This, too, is labor. Underrated labor. To keep a house human while history is making men less human somewhere else. There were losses around us. Telegrams. Shutters half closed. Women walking differently after the postman had visited. Every time I saw one, I felt two things at once. Pity and relief so ugly it made me despise myself for a full hour afterward. There. Another wartime truth people do not like. Every spared household lives partly on the grief of other households. You see a woman collapse over paper and some monstrous selfish part of you thinks, not ours. Not today. And then the decent part of you catches up and you hate yourself. That was waiting. Not noble all the way through. Just human under strain. When the war finally bent toward ending, the entire town seemed to hold its breath badly. There was joy, yes. How could there not be? But joy in wartime aftermath is always a crowded room. It contains relief, jealousy, dread, exhaustion, and the slow, terrible sorting of who comes back, who does not, and who comes back altered beyond the vocabulary available to the people who kept the home fires neat and legal. Thomas came back. I need that sentence honored. He came back. There are widows who would have given everything I later complained of for the one miracle of that sentence alone. I know that. I have never stopped knowing it. He came back. I met him at the station. I remember his uniform before I remember his face. Not because his face mattered less, because the uniform struck me first as proof. He was thinner. Yes. Older in the eyes. Yes. A little stiffer in the shoulders. Yes. But alive. He held me, and I remember thinking, not poetically, just with the blunt gratitude of the half-damned, that he was warm. Warm. Not paper. Not memory. Not a name still moving somewhere beyond maps. Warm. That first night home, I thought the worst was behind us. That is how innocent the first still was. I thought reunion was restoration. I thought a body returned meant a life resumed. I thought home, if kept carefully enough, could absorb war and neutralize it the way good soap lifts grime from a collar if one works at it long enough. I did not understand that war stains inward first. At the beginning, the differences were small enough to be explained. He startled more easily. He was tired. Of course he was tired. He liked his chair facing the room. He ate quickly. He disliked crowds. He did not care for sudden loud laughter behind him. All understandable. All forgivable. All. In those first weeks, easy to fold into gratitude. He was here. Let the rest take time. That is what I told myself. And some of it was true. A returning man needs gentleness, space, Less questioning than a wife's heart naturally wants to ask. Permission to re-enter slowly. I gave him that, gladly. But there came a point. No dramatic date, no one unmistakable evening, when I began to understand that time was not merely healing him. It was revealing what war had preserved in him and what it had broken loose permanently. He slept badly. Again, too small a sentence. He slept as if rest were dangerous. Some nights he fell asleep so fast it looked like collapse. Others he lay there rigid under the blanket, not speaking, and I could feel wakefulness radiating off him like fever. Then the nights began. The first one frightened me so badly I nearly called a doctor. He cried out, not loudly enough for the neighbors, thank God, but from some depth I had never before heard in him, and came half upright in the bed with his hands out as if defending himself from a thing only he could see. I touched his arm. He jerked away from me so violently I nearly fell. Then he saw me, or recognized me. Those are not always the same. His face in that moment. There are faces wives learn no one else will ever meet. Not because they are private by nature, because they appear only where love and terror overlap in darkness. He was ashamed almost immediately. That, more than the shout, broke my heart. Not the fear, the shame after. He apologized. I told him not to. Of course I did. But apology became one of the quiet pillars of our marriage after the war. Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. Sorry, the noise caught me. Sorry, I forgot what day it was. Sorry, I'm tired. Sorry, I just need a minute. And I became practiced in saying, it's all right, long before I knew whether it was. The house learned him differently after that. A dropped pan in the kitchen, the backfiring truck in the street, the 4th of July, which I came to hate with a kind of civic bitterness no one around me understood. People called fireworks celebration. I watched my husband vanish behind the eyes and knew celebration had simply chosen someone else's vocabulary. There were happy days. I must say that. He did not come home incapable of joy. That is too simple and too cruel to the years we did have. He laughed with our children, built them toys, fixed shoes, taught our son to shave and our daughter to ride a bicycle, kissed me in the kitchen when no one was looking, worked hard, held me tenderly on evenings when the world felt kind enough to let us forget itself. All of that was true, but another truth lived beside it. There were moments, without warning, when I would look at him and know he was not fully in the room. Not because he loved us less, because part of him had to keep listening elsewhere. War had trained his body to stay half-turned toward danger, even in peace. Especially in peace, perhaps. He disliked sitting with his back exposed. Not from preference. Necessity. His eyes searched exits without seeming to. He measured men more quickly than before. Crowds exhausted him. Celebrations did too. Once, at a church social, someone came up behind him and clapped him on the shoulder in jest. Thomas turned so fast, so hard, with such naked alarm in his face that the man stumbled backward laughing, then stopped laughing when he saw there had been no humor in it at all. On the walk home, my husband said almost nothing. I slipped my hand into his arm and felt the muscles there still tight as wire. I said, "You don't have to go to those things if you don't want to." He answered after a long time, "I want to." That sentence stayed with me, not because it was poetic, because it was the first time he had named the split. I want to. That is what war leaves in many marriages. A second layer of absence. Not refusal, Refusal's sadder cousin. Desire interrupted by damage. We had our first child 2 years after the war. People like babies in aftermath stories. They treat them as proof. Life goes on. Healing. A fresh start. All those phrases. And yes, there is grace in a child. A real one. A body insisting the future has not resigned. But children do not cure war. They illuminate it. Thomas held our son with such awe that I thought for one dangerous, weak perhaps fatherhood had drawn him back fully. Then our son cried one night, sharp and sudden, and my husband entered the room already breathing like a hunted man. He caught himself, held the baby carefully, spoke softly. No harm done. Not outwardly, but I saw, more clearly than ever, that his body lived too near alarms. He loved our children fiercely. That is not in doubt. War had not dulled his capacity for love. If anything, it made love more urgent, more protective, more afraid. That is the shape few people appreciate. Traumatized men do not always become cold. Sometimes they become overwatchful, too careful, too quick to imagine loss because they have already met it in person. He checked windows, doors, stoves, roads before letting the children cross even after they were old enough to do so safely. He was patient in some things and startlingly abrupt in others. A child could spill milk and he would laugh. A child could vanish behind a tree for 30 seconds and return to a father pale with a fury that was mostly terror, wearing the wrong face. I became translator. That is what many wives become after war. Interpreters between damage and family. Daddy's just tired. He didn't mean it that way. Loud surprises make him jump. Give him a minute. He's not angry at you. These were not lies. Not exactly. But neither were they the whole truth. The whole truth is too large for children and too impolite for supper. Sometimes I resented being translator. There. Let the sentence stand. I loved him. I understood. As much as a person can understand another's war without having been inside it. And I resented, sometimes, that I had become caretaker not only of house and children and bills and ordinary domestic weather, but of the invisible border between his pain and everyone else's innocence. No one prepares young wives for that. Marriage vows do not come with instructions for how to share a bed with a man who wakes gripping air as if it were the last thing keeping him alive. Church ladies do not explain how lonely it is to be grateful your husband survived while grieving the man he used to be. What would they say if they did? Congratulations. He came home, but your life will now contain a third presence with no name, no body, and no respect for holidays? No. They said what they knew. Men don't talk about war. He'll settle. Give him time. You're lucky. Lucky. That word. I wanted to strike it out of the language some years. Lucky that the man sleeping 3 inches from me did not fully trust sleep. Lucky that our child learned before first grade how to read the weather in his father's silence. Lucky that a dropped dish could empty an entire evening of peace. And yes, lucky that he lived. This is the unbearable doubleness of war aftermath. Two opposite truths can sit at the same table and neither will leave. I was lucky, and I was grieving. I never left him. That is not a boast. It is just what happened. There were years when affection came easily. Years when it had to be chosen more deliberately. Years when I was tired enough to imagine a life with fewer silences and no night terrors and less apology. Then he would look at me in some utterly unguarded moment, washing his hands at the sink, or asleep in one rare peaceful hour, or standing in the yard watching our children and smiling with his whole body for once. And I would remember the man who had come back, yes, but had also been fighting a war in the dark every day since. Compassion returns strongest when it catches a person unperforming. He did try. That matters. He tried to be home, tried to laugh, tried to sit through fireworks for the children once and failed so badly, he had to go behind the house and stand with both hands braced on the wall. I found him there afterward. He was furious with himself. I should be able to sit through noise, he said. It isn't just noise to you. He looked away. I'm tired of being treated like something damaged. I said, very quietly, then stop talking as if I'm the one doing it. That was one of our worst fights and one of our most honest. Because marriage after war is not sainthood. It is collision, tenderness and resentment, gratitude and hunger, loyalty and fatigue. Love trying to survive inside rooms where one person is being ambushed by memory and the other by helplessness. Helplessness is what no one warned me about. Not his helplessness. Minni. There is no lonelier place in a marriage than standing next to someone you love while knowing the battle currently swallowing him happens somewhere you have never seen and cannot enter even now. You can bring water, a hand, silence, gentleness, space. You cannot bring him back from what he is reliving because you were never there in the first place. That is the true exclusion. War makes widows, yes. It also makes wives into witnesses without jurisdiction. Time passed. That phrase is too smooth for what actually happens. What actually happens is repetition. Nights, meals, children sick, bills paid, repairs made, bad weeks, good weeks, weather, Christmases, birthdays, arguments, tenderness, ordinary life continuing not because the war has ended inside the marriage, but because ordinary life is stubborn enough to grow around damage if given enough years. He softened in some ways as he aged, hardened in others. The children grew, and as they grew, some of the domestic alarms lessened. No more babies crying through walls. No little feet appearing unexpectedly behind him. No toy gunshots from boys playing in the yard without receiving a look from me sharp enough to end the game. But age does not cure every wound. Sometimes it only teaches the body more elaborate habits of concealment. He got quieter, not colder. That is important. Quieter. More careful with words. More likely to leave a room than risk saying what fatigue made dangerous. Sometimes I think war taught him that speech itself could issue consequences too large to risk casually. He never became a man of many words after that. And yet, every so often, there would be a sentence so piercingly honest I felt I had been handed the hidden interior of him for 1 second before it shut again. Once, much later, when the children had already moved out and the house had become too large for only 2 people and all their old ghosts, he said to me at supper, "I know you lost something too." I put down my fork and did not trust myself to answer. He went on, eyes still on the table. "I just don't know what it was." I cried then, not prettily, not in some cinematic revelation. Just the exhausted tears of a woman who had waited half a lifetime to hear the missing noun spoken aloud. I said, "Sometimes I think I lost the man who didn't know to flinch." He nodded as if he had suspected that. And then, after a long silence, he said, "I miss him too." That is as close as we ever came to naming the third presence in our marriage. He died before I did. That seems fair somehow, though grief is rarely fair enough to deserve such tidy language. not by war, not dramatically, by age and the body's old eventualities, a quieter leaving than the one I had feared for him through youth. At the end, he was more himself in some ways than he had been in decades. Age stripped some pretenses, pain stripped some more. He thanked nurses, held my hand, slept more gently than I had seen him sleep since before the war. Once, near the end, he opened his eyes in that drifting borderland between pain and memory and said, "I hope I was home enough." I told him yes. Was that entirely true? Truth is a harsh instrument at the edge of death. What mattered then was not measurement. What mattered was love. And I did love him. The whole strange, altered, difficult, faithful man he became. After he died, people said the things people say. He was a good man. He worked hard. He loved his family. He'd been through a lot. Through a lot. Such a soft little phrase for a war that had lived in his spine for 40 years. Widowhood surprised me, not because I did not expect grief, because of which grief arrived. I missed his body in the house, yes, his chair, his cough, his boots, his careful hands, but I also missed the work of understanding him. That startled me, the interpreting, the watching, the little adjustments a wife makes without calling them labor. Without him there, the whole old weather remained in the walls and in me, but there was no longer anyone to shelter from it except memory itself. That is when I began to understand the full shape of what war aftermath had done. Not only to him, to me. I had become, over the years, a woman with unusual reflexes. A woman who disliked sudden noise. A woman who read men's silences too quickly. A woman for whom "he's home" had never entirely meant he's free. It had changed my nervous system too. Less violently, less centrally, but truly. That is another thing history fails wives. It counts the dead, the wounded, the decorated, the missing. It does not count the women who spent 30 years sleeping beside the war. I began this recording because of a drawer. How domestic that sounds. How correct. A drawer of old letters tied too neatly with ribbon gone brittle. Courtship notes. War letters. Receipts. School notices. A child's drawing of the house with all four of us standing in front. Thomas smiling in a way he did on good days and rarely for photographs. And there, among the letters, one note I had forgotten. A small scrap in his hand, written years after the war but before old age had made writing tremble. I recognized it instantly because it was so unlike him to leave written feeling. It said only, "Thank you for living beside what came back." I sat with that line for a very long time, not because it solved anything, because it acknowledged what no one else ever quite had. That was when I understood I wanted to speak. Not to accuse him. Never that. He had suffered enough under his own weather. Not to perform sainthood. I was no saint. There were days I was impatient, resentful, lonely, unfair. I wanted to speak because women like me disappear from history too easily. The wife who stayed. The wife who understood. The wife who was grateful. Yes, all true. And incomplete. I was also the wife who grieved a living man without betraying him. The wife who translated trauma into family weather reports. The wife who taught children which noises to avoid and which silences to respect without making their father into a stranger. The wife who lay awake after he finally slept and wondered whether love means accepting a ghost into the marriage and setting one more place at the table without ever naming why. That story belongs somewhere too. So let me say this now plainly. Thomas, you came home. That is the first truth. And you came home different. That is the second. Both deserve air. You were not broken in the cheap sentimental way people say of soldiers after a drink too many. You were altered, trained by fear, ambushed by memory, loving still, useful still, funny some days, distant others, ashamed too often, brave in ways nobody decorated, because your later bravery consisted mostly of continuing to live inside a house that could not possibly understand the place you had left parts of yourself behind. And I watched you, not as jailer, not as martyr, as wife. Which is to say, I watched from close enough to see what no one else had the right to name. If you are listening to this and you love a veteran, understand something. Coming home is not one event. It is a negotiation, sometimes a lifelong one. Do not imagine that a man crossing a doorway means every part of him has crossed with him. Do not mistake gratitude for healing. Do not assume love erases memory. Love does many things, beautiful things, necessary things. It does not erase artillery from the nervous system. It does not make sleep safe. It does not teach the body overnight that a kitchen is not a battlefield simply because the wallpaper says so. And if you are listening as someone who has lived beside war without ever wearing the uniform yourself, let me say this too. Your grief is real even if no one built a language for it. You are not disloyal for mourning what changed. You are not ungrateful for noticing what never came back. You are not weak for growing tired of being brave in such domestic, repetitive, unphotographed ways. I wish someone had told me that when I was 30, or 35, or 40. Instead, I learned it in old age, where most women learn everything important too late and then get called wise for the inconvenience. I do not regret marrying him. Never. I do not regret staying. Never. I regret only how long I believed that gratitude forbade grief. It does not. Before war, a wife thinks love means building a life together. During war, she learns love can also mean waiting without certainty, holding a place for a body that may never come through the door again. After war, if he returns, she learns love may mean something harder still. Living beside what came back, loving what remains, mourning what is not, and refusing to turn either truth into betrayal. That is the labor. That is the aftermath. That is the part no band plays for. If tonight, after I turn off this recorder, I dream of him again, I hope it is not in the frightened half-light, not with his body braced against sounds I could not hear in the same way. I hope I see him before, at the church picnic, his hands folded while he thought, his laugh arriving slow and true. The man who asked whether I liked autumn for the weather or for the excuse to become sentimental. That is where I would like to leave him. Not in the war. Not even in our hardest years. At the beginning. Still walking toward me.